What should you read to understand North Korea? The Times' op-ed columnist Nicholas Kristof joins us to talk about his reader's guide to one of the most inaccessible countries on earth. How are dragons just like kids? Best-selling author Tui Sutherland joins us to talk about what it is that makes fantasy so compelling for young readers. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Nicholas Kristof joins us now. He is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, and we are very lucky to have had him write a reader's guide to North Korea for the book review this week. Nick joins us now. Hi, Nick.
Hi, good to be with you, Pamela.
So this is an interesting assignment because North Korea, of course, is one of the least known countries in the world. I think your lead to this essay sums it up perfectly. You wrote, North Korea may be the most secretive and totalitarian country in the world, as well as the wackiest, which makes it good material for books, both fiction and nonfiction. And you kind of covered the spectrum in this essay. How did you decide which books and sort of which genres to focus on?
You know, it was actually a little bit painful. I've been covering North Korea since the 1980s, and there have been, some wonderful books that originally I was going to include Barbara Demick's Nothing to Envy, which is one of maybe the best of the journalistic books about North Korea. I was going to include one by a North Korean author which kind of gets to the wackiness of it. But of course, one has to pick. And one of the things that is really new and different about the literature about North Korea is that more and more you have North Koreans themselves who are fleeing the country and then writing their memoirs. And that gives us a really much deeper sense of what daily life is like and what people think. And also they're just great yarns because they obviously involve some kind of escape from the country.
Right. Well, and there have been a huge, as you mentioned, number of them in the last 3 years, I think, in particular. But before we go into that, let's just set the setting here a little bit. What does publishing look like in North Korea? Can anyone write there? How controlled is it? And is there any kind of publishing industry there at all?
So North Korea is truly the most totalitarian country in the history of the world. And I've reported in so many repressive dictatorships. North Korea is not remotely like them. There is no samizdat dissident literature. There are no dissidents. When there are protesters being clubbed in the streets of Pyongyang, that will be huge progress because that will mean that people are brave enough to dissent. So the publishing industry in North Korea consists of, you have newspapers like Nodong Shinmun, which is 100% government voice, party voice. And then you have books that basically are hagiographies of the leadership. And so whenever I've been to North Korea, I've bought some of these, of course. And one of my favorites was by the former leader, Kim Jong-il, and it was something on the lines of how to be a good journalist.
I'm sure you found that very useful.
I did. I actually had it on our coffee table for a while, and a bunch of other journalists visiting North Korea bought that book. And I think at some point they realized that the reason we were all buying this book involved a certain element of mockery, and it immediately disappeared.
Well, it brings up an interesting question then for those who escape North Korea and write memoirs. It's got to be dangerous, not only for them, even if they've escaped, but presumably for anyone they've left behind, family members, friends, anyone with any kind of connection to them, isn't it?
The thing is that even escaping is dangerous for relatives left behind. And it's dangerous for them if you simply escape into China, but it's more dangerous if you then go and settle in South Korea, which is really the only place you're going to feel safe because China does regularly return people who fled. And so it's this terrible dilemma for North Koreans that if they go and create a future for themselves, then they put at risk the people they love the most back in North Korea. And they typically try to address this by changing their names, by hiding their identity, but especially in cases where people, write books that get a certain amount of prominence, then, I'm sure North Korea goes to some effort to try to figure out who these people are. And I suspect that their loved ones behind are indeed often sent to labor camps.
And then there are those people who are not North Korean but get into the country, write about it, and then leave. There's also an interesting moral dilemma there, too, because the people that they write about then might be endangered by what appears in those books.
Yeah, although I must say that in most cases, people are so careful not to say anything that would get the government in trouble, that most of those memoirs are more about kind of how wacky people are and how crazily loyal they are, rather than how, to the degree to which they dissent. On my first trip to North Korea, I met he's a friend of a friend who was Chinese, working for the Chinese Communist Party in North Korea. He was ethnically Korean himself, and so Korean was his mother tongue, even though he grew up in China. And he had spent, I think, 15 years in North Korea, and he told me that he'd never had a single honest conversation with a single North Korean in all those years. And so, the idea made me think the idea that I'm going to walk up to somebody and tell them, and say, so, what do you really think of the regime? Probably not very likely.
Right.
It's just the most guarded. People are extraordinarily guarded because they know that if they cross a line and make a mistake, then they are not only putting themselves at risk, but their entire family will be shipped off to a labor camp.
There's another issue in terms of accuracy that you raise in your essay with regard to firsthand accounts, which is that there is, on the one hand, the fear that they might withhold certain things out of wanting to protect people. But then, as you say, there's some incentive when selling a memoir to embellish adventures.
I'm a little wary of this genre for that reason. I think they should be read with a little bit of skepticism. And partly it's that those people who are most likely to escape tend to be those who have the worst experiences, and that when people have these terrible experiences, then they exaggerate sometimes. And coupled with that, you also have a financial incentive to embellish. And if you heard about something, then, maybe it becomes something you witnessed, especially, in a country that doesn't have any tradition of this kind of nonfiction memoir writing. And so I think we, in consuming these memoirs, we should be a little bit wary.
Nonetheless, despite all those caveats, you do point to two memoirs in your essay that you especially recommend. The first is In Order to Live, A North Korean Girl's Journey to Freedom by Yeonmi Park, written with Marianne Vohlers. Tell us about that book.
I mean, it's just just gives us a wonderful texture of life there. Yeonmi Park, her father was a cigarette smuggler and a black market trader. They lived in a border town in North Korea right next to China. And those areas have become very involved in smuggling. They're exposed to information about the rest of the world. Often they have relatives who are just on the other side of the border in China. And so her dad, like a number of people there, was a smuggler, and they lived a pretty good life. And then he was arrested for smuggling. He presumably didn't quite bribe enough. That's usually how people get out of trouble when they're caught. And then the whole family's life just collapsed. And Yeonmi and her sister had to drop out of school. They were surviving by eating insects and wild plants. And then she and her mom escaped into China, and then were controlled by human traffickers, partly because China does not give refugee status to North Koreans. Traffickers play a crucial role in both protecting North Koreans in China and also exploiting them and abusing them. So Yeonmi Park was in this netherworld in China. She and her mom were raped by these traffickers, And finally, though, they managed to escape to Mongolia and then on to South Korea.
How did they escape?
They worked with traffickers, and Mongolia was, at that point, kind of a standard escape route. They were taken to an area close to the Mongolia border and then pointed, at night to where go in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And they hiked all night and crossed the border and then ran into some Mongolian soldiers. And the soldiers were trying to be, formal, defending their country. And these North Koreans were just so thrilled and celebrating that they had arrived that it was kind of comical. They were just so relieved that they had managed to cross the border and get out of China, where they were at constant risk of being sent back.
All right, you write about another memoir, interestingly, I guess, from a woman from the same sort of smuggling town on the Chinese border that Park came from, and that book is The Girl with Seven Names, a North Korean defector's story by Hyun-seo Lee with David John. Why The Girl with Seven Names? What does that mean?
She also grew up in, as you say, in this town, Hyesan, on the border, and then went into China at 17. And she's clearly just a really, really smart, adaptable, resilient young woman. And she keeps changing her identity. And so she keeps assuming a different name and eventually managed to obtain a Chinese ID card and pass herself off as Chinese. And at that point, she had a certain amount of protection. She had a good job in Shanghai, but it's always, it's always fragile, always a risk. And if she had been sent back to North Korea, President Trump, I must say, spoke a few months ago, and he said that in that situation, people are executed. No, that's not quite true. People are not usually executed for fleeing North Korea, but they are sent to labor camps. So she finally was able to escape with her mother through Southeast Asia and then resettle in South Korea.
I think the obvious question people ask themselves when they hear these stories and they hear what it's really like in North Korea is, how did it get this way? I mean, how did this situation come to be? And I'm assuming there are many books that cover North Korean history, the Korean War, and then onward from there. Which books do you recommend, sort of, if you want to kind of get a primer on North Korean history to understand how this situation evolved? What would you recommend?
So there's one book that, in my mind, just really stands out in that respect. It's Bradley Martin's book, Under the Loving Care of the Fatherly Leader. And he goes through the sweep of North Korean history. He spent many, many years working on it, digs up incredible material about the founder of modern North Korea, Kim Il-sung, who was a fairly minor guerrilla leader fighting the Japanese, working with the Russians. And in fact, there was some thought that Kim Il-sung was a complete fake, that he simply assumed the name of this other guerrilla leader. But Bradley Martin says that no, that's probably not true, that this really was the Kim Il-sung. And then when the Russians grabbed hold of the northern part of the Korean peninsula after the Japanese were defeated at the end of World War II, then they needed a Korean to install as their puppet, as their leader. And because of his efforts against the Japanese, which had given him some, genuine nationalistic credibility, so they installed him.
One of the things about the wacky factor, again, with North Korea is it's kind of catnip for fiction writers. And there was one book that came out last year, which ended up being one of our 10 best books of the year, Min-jin Lee's Pachinko, which begins in North Korea and talks about the sort of working poor there, the rural poor, and their emigration over to Japan, and then is mostly centered around the experience of Koreans in Japan. But it brings up North Korea in many ways because a lot of North Koreans were then sort of trapped in Japan and unable to return or had their families divided. And so I was thrilled to see that you have a novel on your list. Tell us about why you chose to put Adam Johnson's The Orphan Master's Son.
Adam Johnson is just an extraordinary writer, and the idea of writing a novel set in North Korea about a military man who was involved in early on in abductions of Japanese citizens, which is something that historically did indeed happen, then involved in negotiations with visiting American officials. It's just this incredible yarn set in North Korea that, look, this is fiction, but Adam Johnson did his research, and I was struck in reading it how there would be allusions to real events that I was familiar with that were not well known. And so it's just a wonderful read, a great page turner. The structure is particularly interesting, and I think it's just a great window into how North Korea actually works, into the labor camps, what they're like there, how people manage to survive in some of them when they do. But I would advise you, if you're visiting North Korea, not to have that in your bag.
Probably not wise. There've got to be some journalistic books, sort of current affairs, recent accounts of what the situation is right now in North Korea. Any books of that nature that you'd want to recommend?
So there are books that are kind of constantly coming out, but I think that at least to me, the issue that is most interesting is, what do North Koreans themselves believe? And do they buy into the propaganda, or do they reject it? And I think that's changing. In fact, I think that over the last 5 years or so, North Koreans have learned more about the world. I thought it was interesting that in one of the North Korean memoirs, I mentioned that her eyes were opened by seeing a smuggled version of the movie Titanic.
And yeah, it's a great story.
And it's obviously not political at all. It's not about North Korea, but she was just kind of amazed that two young people can fall in love and cannot care about the regime, but they can choose their own destinies. And there's one book that I mentioned called The Cleanest Race, How North Koreans See Themselves. And it focuses on North Korean government propaganda, which is nonstop and constant. But one also does get the sense that the propaganda apparatus is breaking down to some degree, especially among younger people, and especially in areas closer to the North Korea-Chinese border. And, people can now pay a repairman on the black market to tweak your radio illegally so that it will get international broadcasts. You can, likewise, they have smuggled thumb drives with foreign movies, with South Korean music. And I think that this is probably having more effect than we think. And just listening to South Korean pop songs or love songs, I think, tends to undermine all the regime rhetoric about how one must always be ready to fight and support the government. I think that's maybe the most effective way of opening minds.
The power of culture.
Yeah, it really is. And we don't have many levers to bring about change in North Korea. It's an incredibly frustrating place to make policy. But one of the suggestions of some North Korea watchers whom I respect, and it makes sense to me, is that we should support more of these smuggling efforts to bring in information and material through thumb drives. There are markets that are beginning to open up around the country. The black market is real, and that's something that over time can perhaps help bring down the regime.
Perhaps even smuggling books one of these days.
Absolutely. I want to see the Korean edition of some of these memoirs, or of The Orphan Master's Son, the Adam Johnson book. I want to see those circulating in North Korea. When I'm offered a copy of Orphan Master's Son in Korean in a market in North Korea, boy, we'll know things have changed.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you so much. Before I let you go, one non-North Korean question, but about books. What are you reading right now?
So I'm just finishing up a book by Steven Pinker called Enlightenment Now, which is coming out next month, and a fantastic book. Especially everything seems so bleak right now, And Professor Pinker argues that, have some perspective, that in the longer run we have made enormous progress against disease, against poverty, and that the way to ensure such progress is to A, trust science, and B, not let the pessimists think that the past was better and that we have to just make America great again.
Right. Well, we could all use a dose of optimism. All right. Thank you so much, Nick.
Sure. Good to speak to you, Pamela.
You too. And that was Nicholas Kristof joining us to talk about his primer on what to read about North Korea to better understand the country, which is in this week's book review. Tui Sutherland is here now to talk about her many books, the latest of which is a graphic novelization of the first in her Wings of Fire series. And these are all books for children, but children of all ages. So Tui, thank you for being here.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, you are super famous in my household. We have 3 in-house fans. And one of the great things is that you've written for many ages, right? The Pet Trouble, sort of very young end of the spectrum, and then going up almost to YA, or at least to upper middle grade.
Yeah, no, and YA. I've written some teen books as well.
Okay,
yeah.
And you write under a lot of pseudonyms, not just... Okay, tell us a little bit about this pseudonym thing. Obviously, authors of all ages and in all formats and genres do this, but it seems to be prevalent these days in kidlit.
Well, I was very lucky to get to work on a whole bunch of different projects kind of all at once. And so it actually made it a little easier to have them all under different names to kind of differentiate the sort of projects I was working on. But some of them are very specific to that project. So, for instance, Erin Hunter, which is the name of the sort of made-up pseudonym that we gave to the Warriors books and then the Seekers and Survivors, this sort of spin-off series. And for that, we had, at the beginning, 3 authors working on them. And then I joined as the 4th author. I was the editor when it first started.
Oh, wow. Okay, because the Erin Hunter thing is a whole other conversation that I want to have. But you've done books under other pseudonyms as well.
Yes, yeah, that's true. So I wrote a Little House on the Prairie spinoff, 2 of them actually. And with those, I had to choose, they asked me to choose a last name that would be shelved next to Wilder in libraries and bookstores. And so I chose Williams because that's the name of my college.
You didn't want to do Wildest or...
That would have been awesome, actually. I should have thought of that. So it was little things like that. Tamara Summers was one that I made up because they were teen books, and I was trying to differentiate them from my sort of Pet Trouble series, which is for younger kids. So there's sort of a different reason for each one.
Do you think of the books that are under your own name as sort of like your core books in any way?
Yes. Well, and now I'm mostly working on things that are really just all mine. And so like the Menagerie trilogy, I would say Pet Trouble as well, and Wings of Fire.
All right. Well, we'll talk mostly about Wings of Fire, but I want to go back to Erin Hunter since you brought it up because it is such an interesting project. So tell us about who Erin Hunter is and how she began her career.
Sure. Well, I was an editor at HarperCollins, and we were brought this project that was about clans of cats sort of doing battle in the forest. And this young hero who's like an outsider, he was raised as a kitten in a human household, but he escapes into the woods. And the main sort of person who came up with the ideas was Vicky. And she talks about how I think one of her cats ran away, and she was trying to imagine what his adventures might have been like in the woods. And so Vicky would write the outline for each book in the series. And then she would send it to me as the editor to sort of review before she gave it to one of the authors. And then I'd give her comments. And usually my comments were like, Vicky, there's too many dead cats in this book. Because Vicky's super bloodthirsty. So she would, so we'd go back and forth trying to like save a few cats. And then she would pass it on to one of her authors. Initially, it was Kate and Cherith. And then when I left editing to write full time, it was just when the series was like really huge. And
yeah,
so,
how many books has Erin Hunter written?
Oh my gosh, I couldn't tell you. There's so many.
I don't think anyone knows.
I know, because the Warrior series, they go in 6-book arcs, and I know that there were at least 3 when I was still there, and there've been I think 2 more since I left. And then Seekers, there's I think a couple 6-book arcs there, and Survivors, I'm not even sure. It's hard to keep up with.
So as a parent of readers of these books, at a certain point you start to think, okay, Erin, like you are not a human being. How could you possibly write all these books? Is this common in children's books to have multiple authors working as a team under one name?
Well, when the books are coming out this fast, yeah. I mean, it's because we have such great readers that do read so quickly, and we wanted to have the Warrior series coming out as quickly as possible. I mean, there are other examples where we put our real names on the books, like Spirit Animals, which also has multiple authors, but it's a little different because Brandon Mull, as the first author of that series, he's the one who outlined.
Right. It's like the 39 Clues, another series where you have a rotation of children's books authors. What's it like working on those, like coming in to something that already exists?
It's really fun. I actually really love it because it's almost like a writing game. It's like a challenge to get to try and match my voice to the other voices and make sure that I keep the characters consistent with the ones that already existed. I feel like it was really good practice doing all of that stuff before I sort of got into books that I feel like are really my own, like Wings of Fire. And I really feel like I learned a lot from trying to match my style to different authors. Like, I actually think trying to write like Laura Ingalls Wilder was one of the most like useful writing experiments I've ever done, because she writes very differently from I do, actually.
Yes, could not be more different from Wings of Fire, I would say.
But it taught me a lot about like descriptive writing, which is something that it's not my favorite thing to do, is like describe landscapes, which she's really good at. And so I think it made all of my own writing a lot richer.
What is your favorite thing to do in writing?
Oh, dialogue.
Dialogue.
Yeah, I love writing just characters talking on and on endlessly for pages.
Let's talk about Wings of Fire. So for those who have not read the 10 books in the series thus far and don't know, this is a book about dragons.
Yep.
Or a series of books about dragons. How did you come up with the idea?
Well, the first thing that happened actually is my agent said to me, have you ever thought about writing a series about dragons? And I got so excited because I loved dragons as a kid. I was a huge Anne McCaffrey fan. Dragon Song is probably one of my favorite books of all time. And I started thinking after he said that about what a world full of dragons would be like. And you know, most of the books that I'd read about dragons, the humans were always sort of in charge in some way, or riding the dragons or interacting with them. And I thought, I feel like a normal human-dragon interaction would just involve the human getting eaten.
Right.
And so
this is the dragon-centric view.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to write a series where the dragons are the heroes, and they have very human emotions. You know, they go through a lot of sort of complicated psychology over the course of the books. But really, they're the ones at the center of the story. And if you ever do see a human, the dragons call them scavengers because they show up and try to steal their treasure. The humans don't usually last very long.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things that I've heard from my in-house readers is just the extent to which there are sort of inter-dragon relationships. There's like a lot of emotion in here, a lot of heart. And the fans, the readers seem to be, I don't know if it's more girls than boys, or if you know that, but there are a lot of girls who like this. It's almost like playground politics and almost middle school things like played out among dragons.
Yes, absolutely. I was going for that. For like, one of the reasons I love writing fantasy and epic fantasy is that everything feels so big and important. And I do think that I get both, and I feel very lucky about that. I almost feel like I'm tricking boys into reading about really fierce girls and like really complicated relationships by putting a dragon on the cover of these books, you know? So there's a lot of love stuff, and there's a lot of parenting. Actually, there's a lot of parenting stuff.
Did you become a parent when you were writing these?
Yes, I actually turned in the outline for for the first sort of 5 books of the series about 2 days before my first son was born. So I was thinking about it a lot as I was writing. How do parents affect us? And, you know, even if our parents are terrible, can we still save the world? That was a big part of it for me.
It's interesting, too, because if you go in, there is, as with so many popular series, a big web presence for these books. And you go into the chat rooms, you really do get the impression that there are many girls in there. And they're writing away with lots of emoticons about their feelings about these dragons.
Yeah, it's true. And they come to my events. And one of the things that's my absolute favorite thing about working on this series is how many kids show up with art and fan fiction. Mm-hmm. Like how much they've sort of dived into this world themselves and really feel sort of ownership of the dragons they've created and are, you know, using their imagination. I mean, girls and boys. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's reassuring to me because I have 2 little boys to discover how many boys like care about the stories and their relationships so much. All the kids who show up at these events have these great imaginations and feel very invested in the characters they've created.
And they identify with the dragons. And, you know, you have that question on the website and on your website, like, what dragon net are you? So what is a dragon net? And tell us about the different ones and how that works.
Well, a dragonet is a young dragon. Mm-hmm. It's just the name for the sort of teenage dragons in this world, or child dragons. And I think the quiz on the website is about the first 5 dragonets that feature in the first 5 books. So one of the things that I love about writing the series, too, is that I've decided to have a different main character in each book. Mm-hmm. Because as a writer, I've always liked like creating a character and then seeing them from another perspective, or looking at someone from the outside and then trying to go inside their head. And so I get to do that in every book. I get to be like, well, this is how Clay sees Tsunami and Glory and Sunny, but this is how Sunny sees herself. And it's different depending on who you're inside of. You know, everyone's the hero of their own story, that whole thing. So of the 5, there's Clay is the one in the first book, and he's a mudwing, and his main characteristic for me is loyalty. Mm-hmm. He's the big brother of the group, and he really holds them together. And I tried to show that because you meet another group of 5 dragonettes, and you see how unhappy they are and how they don't have a good sibling relationship. I mean, none of them are related, but because they don't have Clay. And Clay is the heart of his group. He's the one who holds them all together and keeps them kind of going. Whereas Tsunami is the sea wing, and she's technically the leader, like she's the bossy one, which is a quality that I relate to. So I definitely wanted to write her as leading the group forward, and she's kind of fierce and fearless and doesn't want to be told what to do by any prophecy. So all 5 of them have been told that they have to save the world and that they're in this giant prophecy to stop the war between all the dragon tribes. And they react differently. So Clay is not sure that he's the right dragon for it. Tsunami is really not cool with being told what to do by anything. Glory is a rainwing who was not supposed to be in the prophecy. She was kind of a substitute that came in at the last minute. And she...
You really are getting at all the kid feelings here.
I know. Well, that was what I was thinking about. I was like, and I do this, I talk about it at school visits. I say to the kids, you know, if you were in a prophecy, how would you react? And I get, you know, and I sort of lay out each of the 5 reactions and get them to raise their hands. There's Starflight, who says, okay, I'll save the world if you want me to, but I need some books about that. Can you help me study for saving the world? And Sunny is the one in book 5 who...
What kind of dragonet is she?
She is a sandwing, although there's a secret about her parentage that you find out in book 5. And she's the one who is just excited to save the world. She's like, yay, I'm in a prophecy. This sounds awesome. So, and it's amazing how many kids raise their hands for that one. That's very reassuring to me.
So which dragonet are you, Tui?
I'm Sunny.
You're Sunny? Okay. The secret is out. Or are you open about this?
I'm pretty open about it.
Do kids always ask you that question?
Yeah, they do. Although I think a lot of them know that already, you know, because I do talk about it a lot. I find Sunny, book 5 was the easiest to write because with the others, I was thinking very carefully about how different dragons would react in this situation. But for book 5, I was like, how would I react? What would I do here? And that's one of the reasons I saved her for book 5 is I wanted to get everybody else's perspective on her and how, frankly, annoying she can be sometimes before I got into her head. And most of them think that she's kind of just happy and harmless. And in her own head, she's like, no, I'm totally going to save the world. Somebody should listen to me.
What questions do you get most from kids? Is there one question that they all ask?
Probably what tribe I'm from, like which tribe I would want to be in, or who's my favorite dragonette, which is impossible to answer.
All right. Well, I'll tell you my kids' question, which is, when is the next book coming out? They were under the impression that it was a 10-book series, and then 10 really ends on a cliffhanger. They said, you know, Mommy, it's impossible that it's over. It cannot end in this way.
That's right. Yeah, I've been lucky that I sort of know that ahead of time. So we planned out the first 5 books, and then as I was writing book 5, my editor signed up 5 more. So I was able to drop hints about what was coming in book 6 into book 5. And then same thing with book 10. We actually have 5 more books coming.
5 more?
5 more.
Oh,
so
wow. Now, that was not the original intent, right?
Right. Well, we're sort of doing them in these sort of mini arcs, you know, so it'll be sort of self-contained, like books 1 through 5 kind of deal with one prophecy, books 6 through 10 with a different one. So
you're not going to have to like Aaron Hunterize yourself, are you?
Well, hopefully not. I really love writing these, and I just want to keep doing them as long as I have ideas. So for book 11, actually, I wasn't sure whether to do 5 more because I feel like we've been to all the parts of this continent. And so basically what I did was I introduced another continent, and we haven't gone there yet, but we will in book 11. And so there's going to be new tribes of dragons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm so excited. But
can you give any hints about like what any of the dragonet tribes will be, or is this all top secret?
I think it's all top secret. I can tell you, I think it's okay to reveal, this is something I haven't told anybody else yet, exclusively for you guys, is that there's going to be 3 new tribes. We'll meet 2 of them to start with, and the 3rd one everyone thinks is extinct, but you know, what are the chances of that?
All right. Okay. Well, let's talk about one other project that is about to come out, which is a graphic novel version of Wings of Fire.
Yes, I'm so excited about this. It's coming out in January. And basically what we did was we took book 1 and turned it into a graphic novel, art by Mike Holmes. And he's amazing. The dragons are really pretty, full color. And yeah, I can't wait for people to see it.
Did you know that you wanted it to be a graphic novel? Did you have trepidation?
I've always loved graphic novels. My kids love graphic novels too. I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, so we read a lot of graphic novels in my house. And so when my editor said, would I like to do one with the graphics imprint of Scholastic, I knew we'd be in good hands because we love basically everything that they do.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little nervous because obviously I have all these pictures in my head, but I didn't know if they would turn out the way they look, on the page. Would anyone be able to capture them? And I think he's done a really amazing job. I think, there's always little things that feel a little like, oh, is that exactly how that should be? But overall, it really looks almost exactly like what's in my head. So,
did you have any chance to give input in terms of like, no, the eyes are blue on that dragon? Or
Yes. Oh, they were wonderful about it. Absolutely. They sent me sketches. Actually, the first version of it, because I'd never done a graphic novel before, is we sent the first book to a person named Barry Deutsch, who turned it into a graphic novel script. And he did a great job because, as I've said, I really love writing dialogue. So I was like, how big can the word bubbles be? I can fit as much of my dialogue in as possible. But he did a wonderful job kind of condensing it down to fit into a graphic novel. And then I went through and, made a few changes, added in a bunch of stuff. and then I got to see the sketches from Mike, and then sort of finished art, and then the colored art. It was just amazing how many steps there were actually for a graphic novel. It's been a really fun process.
Do you still work as an editor as well, or are you 100% writer?
No, I'm 100% writer now. I work at home. I loved editing because I loved working with authors on their books, but I hated getting up in the morning.
You don't have to. Well, your kids probably want you to get up in the morning.
They do, but the way it works now is they come running in and wake me up, and I give them some hugs and we chat for a bit, and then they leave and I go back to sleep, and my husband gets them off to school. So I can do most of my writing at night because I'm a super night owl, and then sleep in the morning and then get them after school. So,
has having kids yourself changed in any way your perspective on writing and sort of what kids are interested in and how they read and approach your books or approach books in general?
I'm always writing books that I would have wanted to read as a kid, but now I am thinking hopefully that they'll want to read these books eventually. I guess I've always been interested in writing characters that I would want to be like. Mm-hmm. And so now I'm thinking they're characters I hope my kids will be like. Clay in the first book is certainly, I was thinking about my newborn baby the whole time I was writing it and what he would be like as a big brother and which qualities were most important to me. And so, loyalty and kindness were really important to me.
He's got lots of dragon role models now.
Exactly.
All right. And lots to look forward to for your fans. They have the first version of the graphic novel of book 1 of Wings of Fire and then number 11. Does it have a title?
It doesn't yet. Actually, titles are often the last thing I do. It's hard for me to kind of condense it all into 2 or 3 words.
All right. Well, fear not, Wings of Fire fans. There are 5 more books to come. Tui, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. This was really fun.
Tui Sutherland is the author of many books, many series. The one we're talking about today is Wings of Fire. Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk about what's new in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So I'm very happy with your subject this week, which is to talk about what is coming in the next book season.
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like we just got through the best books of 2017 lists, and suddenly the most anticipated books of 2018 lists have already landed. It's early January. And, the great news is there's some really exciting stuff that's about to be published. We had really good books out in 2017 from literary heavyweights, familiar people like George Saunders and Jesmyn Ward and Geoffrey Eugenides. But in 2018, we're seeing some exciting debut fiction and some possibly career-making fiction by established but less well-known novelists. And so in January alone, there are so many great books coming out. One that's getting a lot of attention right now that's just out is Green by Sam Graham-Felsen. And this is by a former campaign blog director for Barack Obama. And there have been so many books to come out of that particular administration, but this one struck me because it's fiction. It's a literary debut, and it's a sort of coming-of-age tale about a middle school kid who becomes kind of aware of the dynamics of race and class through a friendship that he makes. And then later on this month, another book that I think will get a lot of attention is a book by the late Dennis Johnson. He had finished a final short story collection before he died, and this is coming out on January 16th. It's titled The Large S of the Sea Maiden.
That already sounds like an exciting January, and I know there's a lot of other great books.
More.
What else are you excited about?
On the same day as Dennis Johnson, there's this feminist dystopian novel coming out. It's called The Red Clocks by Lenny Zumas, and it's kind of in the mold of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, or ones that we've seen recently like Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God and The Power by Naomi Alderman. And this is a very kind of timely and frightening look at a future America where abortion has been outlawed and in vitro fertilization is illegal. So she's sort of looking at, the role of women in society and fertility and what happens when they lose those rights. And another thriller that's looking very exciting that's already getting a ton of attention is The Perfect Nanny by Leila Slimani. I'm sure you've been following all the coverage of this book.
Oh, yeah. Lauren Collins had a great profile of her in The New Yorker, and I know that it's on the queue among several people here at the Book Review.
Yes, it's one of the most requested by friends galleys for me. Leila Slimani is a Moroccan woman who lives in France, a French-Moroccan woman, and she was the first Moroccan woman to win France's literary prize, their most prestigious literary prize, the Goncourt. I believe that's what some of the publicity has said. And this is one of those thrillers that sounds like something you might not want to pick up because of the subject. It's about the death of a baby, but it explores what I think is a really interesting and fraught human relationship between parents and the people who take care of their children. So that's getting a ton of coverage. And another January 16th title I'm excited about, basically everything I'm excited about is coming out on a single day, is The Night Masquerade, which is the final installment in Nnedi Okorafor's award-winning Dinty fantasy series. I'm a huge fan of her fantasy, and this is an award-winning series that people have just been waiting to see how she's going to wrap it all up. So that is what is coming in January. And there's even more exciting stuff coming out in February, including An American Marriage by Tayari Jones. This is a novel about an African-American couple who gets separated shortly after their wedding when he's incarcerated for a crime that he didn't commit. And so that happens very early on, but then it explores how their marriage is affected. And it's an interesting kind of, there's some interesting explorations of racial injustice and injustice in the criminal system.
And that's just fiction. And just January.
I'm only looking at fiction. I know now we're a little bit into February, but yeah, people should definitely block out some time on their calendar for reading this year. Another debut that I'm very excited about is Tangerine by Christine Mangan. It's a psychological and social thriller that has already drawn comparisons to Patricia Highsmith. And it's set in mid-century Morocco, which seems like just a great sort of escapist place to go right now. So that's basically January and February. And then some names that will be maybe more familiar that I'm excited about, some authors who have books coming out in April, include Madeline Miller. She is a former classics professor, and she wrote The Song of Achilles. That was her debut, which was a novelization of the Iliad. And her new novel, Circe, which comes out in April, is looking at the witch from the Odyssey, and it's narrated from the witch's perspective, and it's just absolutely gorgeously written and amazingly imagined. And another April book that I'm looking forward to is The Female Persuasion by Meg Wolitzer, which people are already raving about. And that's a very, very timely look at feminism and sort of the complicated relationships between female friends and mentors, and it's centered on a young woman named Greer who works for a famous feminist icon after she graduates from college.
People probably have like a huge to-be-read pile accumulating with just that. Are we going into March, or is that all for now?
I think, that's just a preview of a handful of books I'm excited about for the first part of the year. I'm not even going to go into the summer and fall. There's a ton of stuff coming, including novels from Kate Atkinson and Gary Steingart and books from Lauren Groff and Michael Ndanje. So 2018 is looking like a really, really exciting year for publishing. So I'm sure we'll be talking about all those books in the coming months.
All right. Sounds great. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
We have something really exciting to tell you about here coming up, which is a new book club, Now Read This. It's a collaboration between us here at the New York Times and the PBS NewsHour. And what will happen is there is a Facebook page, you can go online and find it, called the Now Read This Book Club. Every month we're going to be picking a new book, and readers can submit questions for the author and learn more about the book and the author online. At the end of every month, there'll be an interview on air on the PBS NewsHour with the author, and it will include many of your questions. So this is really a participatory book club, and we're super excited to announce the first author on the book club and the first book choice, which is Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. I think many of our listeners here and readers of the New York Times Book Review will be familiar with this book. Of course, it was one of our 10 best books of 2017, and it won the National Book Award. And just a few more things about Jesmyn Ward. I won't go into the book too much because hopefully you will discover it yourselves. But Jesmyn is kind of an amazing figure. She is the first woman to win the National Book Award twice for fiction. Her second novel, Salvage the Bones, won the National Book Award in 2011. And Jesmyn does not only write fiction, she also edited a great anthology, The Fire Next Time, that came out in 2016. And then that was an anthology of essays about race. And she has also written a memoir, very moving memoir called Men We Reaped, about the death of her brother and 4 other young African-American men in Mississippi. She's just kind of a force and really writes about her community. She's from Delisle, Mississippi, which is a small rural town. She's the first person in her family to go to college. She went on to go to Stanford. She was a Wallace Stegner Fellow, just 1,000,001 accomplishments, and she still lives down in Mississippi. And so we're very excited to have this novel, Sing Unburied Sing, as our first featured book and look forward to having many of you participate. So again, you can find it on Facebook. It's called the Now Read This Book Club. And our first pick is, once again, Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, John Williams, Greg Coles, and Jen Salai. Hi, guys.
Hey,
Hi, Pamela.
What are you reading, Jen? Let's start with you.
So I have started reading The Radetzky March by Joseph Roth, which I had never read before. I'd read one of his other novels several months ago, which I think I talked about a bit on the podcast, Right and Left, which I enjoyed. But compared to this one, Right and Left is very much more sort of satire about what happened in Middle Europe. And this one, there's satirical elements, but it's really much more expansive. It's about several generations of a family in the Habsburg Empire, and it's all leading up to World War I. It's interesting to see because each generation seems completely sort of disillusioned with what's happening around them, and also each generation wants to connect with the previous one, but can't really access it in any meaningful way because the reality of their worlds are just so different. And so there's just something deeply moving and very sad about the whole thing. And so right now I'm at a part, sort of a very strange scene where the new generation right now, which is the son of the von Trotta family, he is in the army and, you know, he follows his regiment to go to a brothel. And it's like a totally joyless brothel scene, essentially. And I mean, you can sort of feel that everything's sort of moving and probably converging on the crisis. But right now, just in terms of an evocation of like a certain mindset and a certain sort of feeling of estrangement, it's really great.
I've always thought of that book as very epic, and it looks very manageable size-wise. I'm surprised by it in front of you.
Yeah, it's not.
It's making me feel like I could read it.
It's not enormous. It's not like The Man Without Qualities, which I think this book sort of shares a lot with, but this one is much more contained. So, how about you, Greg?
I'm also reading a very contained book and a very seasonal one. I'm reading the second book of Karl Ove Knausgaard's new seasonal quartet. It's called Winter, and this is the second of a quartet of books that he's writing based on the 4 seasons. So autumn came out over the autumn, and winter will come out, I think, in a week or 2 from now. So it's not quite out, but listeners can buy it already. It's will be out very soon.
It's weird to hear the word contained in the same sentence with Karl Ove Knausgaard and
true, of course.
The word quartet.
Knausgaard, of course, broke huge on the scene with his 6-volume autobiographical novel, My Struggle. This quartet of books shares some things with My Struggle. It's funny, there's something so irritating but also magnetic about Knausgaard as a writer, and it's true in this book as well. These are more essays and very short essays. They're all in that kind of 2 to 3 page length than My Struggle, which had this kind of heedless, headlong rush of prose and episode and event. Here he kind of takes a topic, almost like Montaigne might in the essays. He's like, today I'm going to write about coins. Today I'm going to write about winter boots. Yeah, exactly. There is, in fact, an essay on coins in this book and an essay about winter boots, an essay about winter. They're written as kind of letters to his unborn and now newborn daughter, where he says, it's kind of, I'm going to explain the world to you. He picks this topic and lets his mind kind of unspool about the topic in ways that are often not very original. In fact, I have to say, which I found true in My Struggle as well. There's something captivating about him. He's like your school friend who will just spout off in these kind of elaborate and abstract philosophical theories that, if you poke them, are actually pretty familiar or banal. So the coins essay in here talks about how money has no underlying inherent value with the elimination of the gold standard. It's all just kind of symbolic and it depends on public faith. And that's true, of course.
Right.
And at some point, we all come to terms with that and move on, and we don't devote 3 pages to building a. He's wonderstruck by the idea, and
it's all on trust. It's all based on trust.
And I mean, it leads him to think that capitalism makes fiction writers of us all because we're all complicit in this lie about the value of money, and so. There's the kind of freshman revelation of all of these, which I found true in My Struggle as well. But there is something very honest and refreshing and captivating about him as well. And it is partly that kind of rush of language. And it's the honesty, the willingness to be banal, to kind of lay himself bare like that. So, and he can also, to his credit, really come up with great images. The essay on winter boots, he remembers specifically a pair of winter boots that he had that was hand-me-downs from his older brother when he was a child. And the sole was worn thin, and that coincided with a time that there was this fad among his the Norwegian kids where he was growing up of riding boots downhill. Instead of riding sleds down a hill or skis, you would stand at the top of a hill in your threadbare boots.
This sounds unsafe.
We lost a lot of good boys that way.
And kind of launch yourself down. And so the more
stay
worn
upright?
and stay upright. So the image is, with them on my feet, I could slide down any slope in nearly any weather conditions and reach extremely high speeds. We became good at it. In the evenings, in the yellow light of the street lamps, one could see 3 or 4 skinny boys whizzing down the hill on their boots, some leaning forward like downhill skiers, others standing bolt upright as if this wasn't happening and they were really in a very different situation, talking to someone at a crossroads, say, while others again swayed and tottered like walking pipe cleaners. So, and he's saying that at this moment, these old ragged boots that he had coincided exactly perfectly with this fad for going down the hills, and he became the very best at doing this thanks to these boots.
Speaking of fads, I can't even remember what they're called now, but the kind of motorized scooters we have now. That were going to be the future of transportation.
Segways?
Segways.
They sound like
so
low-tech
sad to
Segways.
see one on a Segway.
Glad it didn't buy stock.
There's a little bit of the nostalgia that you were talking about in the Joseph Roth, is kind of the moment that has come and gone, looking back on that. So that's what I've been reading. John?
I have kind of a book recommendation and a movie recommendation this week, because the book I'm reading is John Keats's Selected Letters, which I've been meaning to read for a long time because they're just supposed to be, this towering literary achievement. But the reason I picked them up at this particular time is because I just watched the other day Jane Campion's Bright Star, which came out longer ago than I had thought, 2009, I think. And that's a movie about Keats and his romance with Fanny Braun, who gets a lot of these letters written to her. And it's just a very beautifully filmed, beautifully written, really beautifully performed movie. So that inspired me. And now I am kind of in the opening stages where it's a little hard to get into it, because these aren't the high lyrical letters to Fanny. They're kind of more business-like letters to friends and family. And there's a lot of armature around them, like describing where he is and who he's writing to. And so I'm not really like into the flow of his voice quite yet, and I'm sure I'll kind of dip in and out throughout the next few months. It's not really a book you read front to back, but I'm enjoying it so far. What about you, Pamela?
You're looking at the desk and I have no book in front of me, and it's because I sort of has a weird tradition, and I don't know if it's appreciated. I've started leaving the books that I read in the house that my family rents in Vermont every winter, and sometimes in the summer. As I don't know, they have a huge number of books in this house, and so I feel that they appreciate these little tokens that we leave behind, and they. When we come back to the house, we always see the books that we've left on their shelves, and it's sort of interesting to see where they've chosen to put them. So I left my books there, and the one that I finished first was Kate Grenville's The Secret River, which I mentioned, I think, the last time I was on, which is a really good historical novel. Kate Grenville is Australian. The book came out in 2005, and I think I mentioned that I was given this book by an Australian literary journalist when I was there last spring, so that I could sort of be introduced to more Australian writers. And it's really a book about colonialism. There are obvious parallels to Heart of Darkness, in that, there's a river, and it's about how colonialism ultimately corrupts the colonializers as much as it, or in different ways, at least, if not the same magnitude, as it corrupts the people who are colonized. And the protagonist is this illiterate bargeman named William Thornhill, who the book starts in London and eventually moves on to Sydney for the reason that people moved on to Sydney in those days, which is that he was a prisoner and sentenced to life in exile in New South Wales. And he gets there, and without giving too much away, he is ultimately drawn to not quite the outback, but certainly the less civilized coastline of Australia, where he attempts to set up his own kind of territory, his own farm, not quite realizing the fact that that own farm is already occupied by the Aboriginal people in Australia. I found it really fascinating, especially as an American, to read this kind of, to look at the parallels and the differences between the experience here in America with Native Americans and the Australians over there. I don't know who is more brutal and who is ultimately sort of more harmed on the colonizing side, but it's pretty dark material. So highly recommend that, The Secret River by Kate Grenville.
That sounds really good.
Yeah, it is really good, but you can't read my copy unless you want to go up to Vermont.
I do want to go up to Vermont. Can I have a week off?
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.